In the golden halls of the Roman Empire, where power was measured in blood, intrigue, and impossible alliances, one man achieved the unthinkable. He seduced 3 consecutive emperors, without being noble, without being a woman, and without even keeping what nature had given him at birth. His name was Favorinus of Arelate, a eunuch whose silver tongue proved more lethal than any sword. Born in a distant province, marked by tragedy from childhood, he transformed weakness into strength and humiliation into power. All of Rome listened to him, from the sands of the Circus Maximus to the libraries of Alexandria. This is the story of the man who reinvented the rules of power in an empire dominated by virility, proving that the most powerful weapon of all was not brute force, but the word. Give it a like and subscribe, because what Favorinus achieved afterward defies all logic of Roman power. The year 80 AD saw the birth, in the prosperous city of Arelate in Gallia Narbonensis, today's Alps in France, of a child destined to change forever the rules of Roman power. Arelate was a vibrant port, where barges loaded with wine, oil, and spices sailed the Rhone toward the Mediterranean. The cobblestone streets echoed with the clash of horse hooves and the bustle of merchants blending Latin, Greek, and Celtic accents. It was at this crossroads of worlds that Favorinus was born, the son of a wealthy family of merchants who dreamed of seeing him become a magistrate or senator. From an early age, he showed signs of extraordinary talent. At 5, he already recited entire passages of Homer and Virgil with such prodigious memory that he left his tutors speechless. At 8, he mastered Latin and Greek with the fluency of an adult scholar. His insatiable curiosity led him to ask about everything: the movement of the stars, the nature of the gods, the art of politics. The neighbors of Arelate called him the philosopher child. His father used to say, "Favorinus doesn't just listen to words, he drinks them." But fate had prepared a cruel irony. During a family trip to Rome, amid the splendor of the empire's capital, the child prodigy would be torn from his family and pushed into a destiny that would mark him forever. Rome, the center of the known world. Among its forums, temples, and markets, a Gallic family walked with the hope of expanding their business. Among them was a boy of barely 8 years, fascinated by the marble statues, the triumphal chariots, and the magnificence of the newly inaugurated Colosseum. That boy was Favorinus. But while his eyes filled with wonder, other eyes, much darker, watched him with sinister intentions. They were slave traders, experts at spotting human rarities that could become valuable commodities. Favorinus was not only beautiful, his precocious intelligence and melodious voice made him a diamond in the rough for a secret and cruel market. In a moment of carelessness, the boy was snatched from his family's arms and taken to a clandestine house in the suburbs of Rome. There, in a damp room lit only by oil lamps, he was subjected to the most brutal operation a child could endure: castration. Most did not survive. But Favorinus, against all odds, endured. His body was scarred forever, and so was his destiny. The mutilation robbed him of the chance to become a soldier or a father, the Roman ideals of manhood, but it gave him something unexpected: a unique, high-pitched, melodious voice that captivated anyone who heard it. The boy who had been born free and privileged became a slave. He was sold like a simple object, and bought by a man whose name would change his life forever: Lucius Nerva Trajanus, a Roman general who would one day ascend to the imperial throne. Lucius Nerva Trajanus, one of Rome's most brilliant generals, was not a man easily impressed. He had seen thousands of soldiers, slaves, and courtiers parade before his eyes. But that fragile boy, with a fiery gaze and a voice that sounded like a divine song, intrigued him. Trajan did not see him as just another slave, but as a project of power. He decided to invest in him. Favorinus was sent to the best schools in Rome. There, under the guidance of the greatest masters of philosophy, rhetoric, and science, he began his transformation. He memorized Homer and Virgil, debated Stoic philosophy with Greek teachers, and mastered mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. At first, the sons of senators despised him. To them, he was only a eunuch, a shadow marked by disgrace. But soon, mockery turned to silence, and silence to admiration. None could match the quickness of his wit or the strength of his words. At barely 18, Favorinus was no longer a slave broken by mutilation, but an orator so brilliant that even the most seasoned senators stopped to listen. Trajan, fascinated, made him his personal companion. At palace banquets, Favorinus entertained him with speeches blending philosophy and politics. His hypnotic voice could make the emperor laugh, reflect, or inspire him to make momentous decisions. During the Dacian campaigns, Favorinus accompanied the general as a counselor. He did not wield a sword, but his words were as sharp as a gladius. He taught Trajan how to understand his enemies, how to read their fears, and how to anticipate their moves. Little by little, without anyone noticing, the eunuch became something far more dangerous than an educated slave. He became the man who whispered into the ear of the future emperor of Rome. 106 AD. All of Rome pulsed with Trajan's victory over the Dacians. The empire celebrated a triumph that would be carved into marble columns and etched into the memory of generations. The Circus Maximus, packed with over 100,000 spectators, thundered with deafening roars. Senators, soldiers, plebeians, and nobles awaited the moment when the emperor would be glorified before the gods and the people. But that afternoon, it wasn't the emperor who stole the show, it was his eunuch. Confident in his protege, Trajan entrusted him with an unthinkable task, to deliver the victory speech. Favorinus stepped onto the platform. He wore a white toga that gleamed like marble under the sun. His voice, high-pitched yet melodious, rose above the crowd. For more than 2 hours, he captivated the whole of Rome. He praised Trajan as the new Alexander, recalled the glories of Caesar and Augustus, and promised that under his rule, Rome would be eternal. But he spoke not only of war, he wove in philosophy, poetry, and reflections on human destiny. Every phrase was measured, every pause a stroke of theater. The senators exchanged glances, unable to deny the greatness of the orator. The people, who at first had watched him with curiosity, ended by applauding him as if he were a god. And the most extraordinary thing, no one thought of his condition as a eunuch. That day, Favorinus ceased to be a castrated slave and became a living legend. Chroniclers would later write that with his silver tongue, he had accomplished the impossible. He made Rome forget what nature had denied him, and remember him only as a man of incomparable genius. 117 AD. Rome shuddered at the death of Trajan. For many of the emperor's favorites, this meant the end. Power transitions usually came with brutal purges. But Favorinus was no ordinary favorite. He had already foreseen this moment. The successor was Hadrian, a man very different from Trajan. Where Trajan was a pragmatic warrior, Hadrian was an intellectual, obsessed with Greece, its temples, its poems, its philosophical mysteries. Favorinus understood he had to reinvent himself. With Trajan, he had been the orator who exalted military glory. With Hadrian, he would become the philosopher who fed his restless mind. Months before Hadrian took power, Favorinus had already begun his subtle work. He invited him to private debates on Plato, impressed him with his knowledge of astronomy, and even challenged him in theological discussions that lasted for hours. One episode remained etched in the memory of the court. During a dinner at the house of an influential senator, Favorinus and Hadrian debated for 4 hours straight about the nature of time. The guests remained silent, spellbound. In the end, Hadrian was not only fascinated, he confessed that no one had ever made him feel so deeply understood. When he ascended the throne, Hadrian appointed Favorinus his personal advisor on cultural affairs. He granted him a palace on the Palatine Hill, incalculable riches, and, above all, unlimited access to himself. Rome whispered. The eunuch has seduced a second emperor. But what existed between Hadrian and Favorinus was not just attraction. Hadrian, who had loved many men, saw in him something different, an intellectual soulmate, someone able to mirror his dreams of being a philosopher emperor and magnify them. Together they traveled through Alexandria, Athens, and Egypt. On every journey, Favorinus was more than a companion, He was the voice that gave meaning to every monument, the interpreter of every symbol, the mirror of every imperial ambition. With Hadrian, Favorinus reached the height of his power. He was no longer a slave surviving in the shadows. He was an imperial philosopher, a man whose influence stretched from the libraries of Greece to the battlefields of Britain. 138 AD. The death of Hadrian ushered in a new era. The throne now passed to Antoninus Pius, a man of a very different character, conservative, rigid, suspicious of anything that smelled of favoritism or extravagance. For Favorinus, this would be his greatest trial. He had won over a warrior, Trajan, and a philosopher, Hadrian, but Antoninus sought neither glory nor ideas, he sought order and stability. The eunuch's enemies knew this. Envious senators seized the opportunity and hurled accusations against him: corruption, illicit enrichment, abuse of influence. They wanted to see him fall once and for all. Favorinus's trial became a public spectacle. The Senate was divided, some saw him as an indispensable genius, others as a threat to Rome's traditional order. And then, amid the tension, the eunuch rose to speak. For 3 hours he spoke without pause. He did not defend himself with pleas or denials. He defended himself with philosophy. "I am accused of 3 crimes against nature," he said. "To be a eunuch, though I did not choose it. To be judged for treason, though I committed no crime. And to have disputed with the emperor, without being defeated." His speech was a masterpiece. He argued that Rome was great precisely because it knew how to make use of the talents of all, slaves, foreigners, even eunuchs. That his life was not an anomaly, but a testament to the empire's inclusive greatness. The Senate was divided, but deeply moved. He was acquitted of the most serious charges, though he lost his place at court and much of his fortune. Antoninus, ever calculating, chose not to execute him, but pushed him into a silent ostracism. Many thought this was the end of Favorinus. But they did not know that the eunuch still had a master card left to play. The quiet exile seemed to have ended his power. Yet far from the palace, Favorinus did not give up. He founded a school of rhetoric on the outskirts of Rome, where he taught what he knew best, the art of seducing with words. Little by little, students from all over the empire began to arrive. Not only the sons of senators, but also merchants, soldiers, and even diplomats. All sought to learn from the man who had conquered 2 emperors and challenged a 3rd in the Senate. Meanwhile, a crisis erupted in the eastern provinces. Egypt was in rebellion. Local leaders had united religious and ethnic factions under a single cry: expel the Romans. The generals sent by Antoninus Pius failed again and again. They had soldiers, but no understanding of Egypt's complex culture. It was then that Favorinus' name began to be heard once more in the halls of power. From exile, the eunuch sent secret analyses through intermediaries, precise warnings, accurate predictions of rebel movements, innovative solutions. When 3 of his predictions came true with mathematical precision, Antoninus Pius had no choice but to summon Favorinus to the palace. The meeting was cold at first. The emperor, distrustful, expected a pleading courtier. But what he found was different. A serene man, who spoke not as one asking for mercy, but as one offering answers. Favorinus did not speak of his past or his talents. He spoke of Rome, of duty, and of how to resolve the crisis. He showed the emperor that his value did not lie in flattery, but in something far more useful: the ability to see what others could not. Within weeks, his plans began to bear fruit. The rebels were persuaded to negotiate, and the bloodshed along the Nile ceased. Antoninus, astonished, understood what no one else had made him see. That this eunuch, despised by many, was in fact the empire's secret weapon. He restored him to the court, and more than that, he made him his chief advisor on Eastern affairs. The eunuch had returned. Not as a favorite, not as a seducer, but as an indispensable strategist. With Antoninus Pius, Favorinus reached a unique position. He was not just an advisor, he was the bridge between Rome and the East, the man who understood what others could not see. But his influence went far beyond the politics of the moment. Favorinus began to codify his philosophy of power, not in cold treatises, but in living teachings for his disciples and reflections that spread throughout the empire. These principles would later be known as the Code of Favorinus, for unwritten laws of true influence. Chameleonic adaptability, not imposing one's essence, but transforming oneself to reflect what each leader needed. Strategic listening, not merely hearing words, but deciphering fears, desires, and silences. Intelligent validation, not empty flattery, but praise that made an emperor feel unique and understood. Indispensable utility, not seeking to please, but to be so useful that dispensing with him became impossible. These principles not only kept him alive in a world full of intrigue, they made him the only man capable of seducing 3 consecutive emperors. The impact was profound. In a Rome obsessed with virility and military strength, Favorinus showed that power could be born from emotional intelligence and the spoken word. Many young aristocrats began to imitate him, dedicating more time to rhetoric, philosophy, and empathy than to the simple art of war. Without intending it, the eunuch had changed the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. After decades at court, Favorinus understood that his power no longer depended solely on emperors, but on something far more enduring, his intellectual legacy. On the outskirts of Rome, he founded a school of rhetoric and persuasion, but it was no ordinary school. It was a secret laboratory of soft power, where he taught what he called the arts of human connection. His methods were revolutionary. He did not deliver endless lectures like other philosophers. Instead, he used role-playing, simulations, and debates, where students practiced how to read a person, how to adapt a speech to their audience, and how to turn disadvantage into strength. From there emerged a generation of men who would occupy key positions in administration, the army, and commerce, all marked by the invisible influence of Favorinus. The eunuch had created something unprecedented, the first school of influence in the ancient world. An institution that turned rhetoric into strategy, philosophy into a political tool, and empathy into a weapon of power. In his later years, he wrote treatises on rhetoric and philosophy that circulated throughout the empire. But the most important achievement was the network of disciples who spread his ideas long after his death. His presence was no longer limited to imperial halls. Favorinus had planted the seeds of an art that would forever transform how Rome understood communication, politics, and power. The year 165 AD marked the end of a life that had defied all the laws of Rome. Favorinus, the eunuch who had survived childhood violence, who had intellectually captivated 3 emperors, and who had created an immortal school of influence, died at the age of 85, a record of longevity in an era when few reached even 50. His funeral was an unprecedented event. Senators, philosophers, generals, and ordinary citizens came to pay tribute. The funeral procession advanced through the Roman Forum, and for a moment, the city that had so often despised him for his condition as a eunuch bowed before him as before an emperor. Most astonishing of all, the aging Antoninus Pius himself delivered the funeral oration. His words were etched into the memory of Rome. Favorinus taught us that greatness does not lie in what nature gives us, but in what we do with what remains. That phrase captured the essence of his life. The child torn from his destiny, turned into a slave, made a eunuch, had been able to forge a legacy more enduring than that of many emperors. In the ashes of his funeral pyre burned an eternal message. True strength is not measured in muscles or lineage, but in the ability to transform adversity into power and words into an immortal weapon. The life of Favorinus was not just the story of a eunuch who captivated 3 emperors. It was living proof that true power does not lie in physical strength or wealth, but in intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to understand others at their deepest level. In a Rome that worshipped virility, Favorinus broke the mold and redefined what it meant to be influential. He showed that limitations, even the cruelest, can become strengths, and that words, used with wisdom, can bend more empires than any sword. His legacy transcends the centuries. It reminds us that in every era, even in our own, true leaders are not necessarily the strongest, but those who know how to listen, adapt, and connect. Favorinus was more than a philosopher, more than a rhetorician, more than an imperial advisor. He was the invisible architect of a new concept of power. Today, nearly 2,000 years later, his life inspires us to rethink our own definition of success and greatness. Because if a child, castrated against his will, could become one of the most influential voices of the Roman Empire, what might we achieve with what we hold in our own hands?